Shalom. Shalom, thank you very much for joining us once again on our Kodago Able channel for a new class in our free course on the Mishnah. But what is the Mishnah? Well, it's nothing more and nothing less than an ancient tradition dating back to the time of the biblical prophets, including Moses at Mount Sinai, which explains the complicated and enigmatic biblical text. In terms of exegesis, the Mishnah is the context of the sacred scriptures. In previous classes, we began with chapter 3 of the Mishnah in its first tractate of Berakhot and studied the laws and customs of a Jewish burial, the wake, and the week of mourning for close relatives. We also studied what happens to the spirit and the soul, which in Hebrew are two separate words at the moment of death. So, in a way, we begin to delve into the knowledge of the spiritual world, of the higher worlds of Yetzirah and Bria, to begin to understand the dynamics of creation in Genesis, which functions as a multiverse where what you do here affects everything else. So, today we begin with a Mishnah in Berakhot 3:4, which for the first time brings to light the concept of purity and impurity as mentioned in the Torah of Moses. Without further ado, my name is Abel Flores, and let's begin. Mishnah Berakhot, chapter 3.4 states, "A person who is a baal keri meditates in his heart and does not bless either before or after." And about food, he blesses afterward, but not before. Rabbi Yehudah says, bless before and after. Obviously, we're talking about the Shema here. We know this because we've been talking about it since chapter 1 of Berakhot. But what is the context of all this? It is as follows. Ezra the scribe, a biblical figure, decreed that one who is ritually impure due to a seminal emission cannot involve himself in matters of the Torah until he has immersed himself in a ritual bath and been purified. This halakha was accepted for many generations, and as you can see, it is a decree of a judge of Israel. I don't say rabbi because Ezra was not a rabbi, nor were there any rabbis in his time, but rather Torah judges, as stipulated in the Torah of Moses itself in Parashat Shoftim, which translates as judges. However, many disputes arose regarding the matters of the Torah to which this restriction on a man who has had a seminal emission applies. In this regard, the Mishnah states, if the time comes for the recitation of the Shema and one is impure due to a seminal emission, one may meditate on the Shema in one's heart, but one does not recite the blessings that precede or follow it. Regarding food that, after eating, Torah law requires a blessing is recited afterward, called the Birkat Hamazon, but a blessing is not recited beforehand, because the blessing recited before eating is a requirement of rabbinic law regarding the blessings of consuming any food. And in all these cases, Rabbi Yehudah says, recite a blessing before and after, both in the case of the Shema and in the case of food. The Mishnah establishes 3 rules for those who are baal keri, males with seminal emission. First, regarding the Kiryat Shema, he meditates in his heart mehar balibo and does not recite the blessings before or after. Second, regarding food, he recites the blessing afterward, but not before. And third, there is a disagreement. Rabbi Yehudah maintains that he blesses before and after both Shema and food. The key concepts here are 3. Baal keri, which is a state of ritual impurity due to ejaculation, according to Leviticus 15. In temple times, it involved immersion to regain ritual purity. The other concept is hirhur, meditating, versus diber, saying the Mishnah allows one to think the Shema without articulating it aloud or its blessings, marking a distinction between devotional thought and normative recitation. And third, the concepts of diorata versus derabanan. The Mishnah assumes that Birkat Hamazon, the prayer after eating, is a biblical mandate written in Deuteronomy 8 verse 10, while the blessing before eating is rabbinic, because it is not commanded in the Torah to pray before eating, but Moses commanded to bless after consuming food. But before beginning this entire study, we must define the primary concept here. What is a baal keri? In rabbinic literature, baal keri refers to a man who has had a seminal emission. The expression already appears in the Torah, Leviticus 15 verses 16 to 18, and in Deuteronomy 23 verse 11, where his state of ritual impurity, which in Hebrew means impurity, is regulated, indicating that The person is considered impure until nightfall. He must wash his body and clothes, and he is temporarily excluded from entering the sanctuary or holy place of the temple. The term, believe it or not, is not pejorative, but it designates a physical ritual state unfit for ritual holiness. In the Torah, seminal emission generates a minor ritual impurity that lasts until nightfall after bathing or entering the mikveh, according to Leviticus 15 verse 16. Deuteronomy 23 verses 11 to 12 states that a soldier in camp who experiences a seminal emission must leave the camp and purify himself before returning. Of course, this is in the context of a war or within the laws of war. This background explains that, in temple times, ritual purity was not only a concept of the sanctuary, but also influenced daily life, eating offerings, entering temple areas, and even fulfilling the most important commandment of the Torah, which is reciting the Shema. But what was the content of Ezra's decree? According to the Talmud in Berakhot 22a, Ezra the scribe decreed that a baal keri would not engage in Torah study or tefillah until he immersed himself in a mikveh or ritual bath. But why? The Talmud, Rambam Maimonides, in Hilchot Kriyat Shema 4:8, and later commentators offer two main reasons: ethical/spiritual, to foster purity and respect for Torah study, and social, to reduce the frequency of sexual relations by imposing a period of ritual preparation before prayer or study. As you can imagine, this decree was difficult to maintain and caused Bittul Torah, reduction in study. The Gemara records that it was eventually repealed. It only remained as a pious custom in certain circles, immersion before prayer. In Talmud Berakhot 21a and 22b, the cases are expanded. If one begins to pray and remembers his condition, he shortens the prayer but does not interrupt it. And the alternative practice of pouring 9 kav of water, approximately 12 to 21 liters, is introduced as a mitigation for those who could not go to the mikveh. By the 11th century, with Rambam Maimonides, this decree of Ezra no longer applies. Anyone can study Torah, pray, and recite Shema, even if they are a baal keri. However, hygiene and cleanliness before praying are still recommended. In the Shulchan Aruch, Aruch Hayim 88, in the 16th century, it is dictated that today there is no impediment. Immersion is a pious custom, but not an obligation. That is, today a baal keri can study, pray, and recite Shema with his Berakhot. Immersion and pouring water are not obligatory, although some pious Hasidim or Hasidim maintain them as a devotional practice. The concept persists more as a historical category than a current norm. The baal keri represents a point of intersection between biblical ritual purity and daily spiritual life. Mishnah Berakhot 3:4 depicts an intermediate phase where the goal was to respect Ezra's decree without suppressing the biblical mandates. Subsequent evolution freed man from this restriction, prioritizing continuous access to study and prayer, maintaining only preparation and inner respect as permanent values. Now, to further understand the concepts and context of what is being discussed in this Mishnah, we must conduct a comprehensive and structured study of Birkat Hamazon, its origin, development, structure, and current status in Halakha. Birkat Hamazon is the blessing of thanksgiving after eating bread, elaborated by the sages of Israel. It is the only explicit biblical commandment to bless after a meal, as Moses taught in Deuteronomy 8 verse 10, unlike the other Berakhot, which are rabbinic. And you shall eat and be satisfied, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. It is written in Deuteronomy 8 verse 10. This phrase is the basis of the halakhic obligation of Birkat Hamazon. Its nature, as we see, is derives. Biblical, it is obligatory upon every Israelite who has eaten bread made from the 5 grains, wheat, barley, spelt, oats, rye, and is satisfied, sevia. But it also has a derabanan, rabbinic, connotation, because even one who is not fully satisfied must recite Birkat Hamazon, and women are also obligated, at least rabbinically, according to some opinions, even biblically. The traditional structure of Birkat Hamazon consists of 4 blessings. According to Talmud Berakhot 48b, the 4 current blessings were organized as follows. 1. Hazan iti holam, sustainer of the world, gratitude for food, attributed to Moses at the time of the manna. 2. Al haaretz v'al hamazen, for the land and for food, gratitude for the land of Israel, attributed to Joshua upon entering the land. 3. Bonei Yerushalayim, he who rebuilds Jerusalem, prayer for Jerusalem and the temple, attributed to David and Solomon. 4. Hatov v'amitiv, the good and the beneficent, blessing added by the sages of Jabna after the tragedy of Bitar in the 2nd century, offering thanks that the bodies of the fallen did not decompose. This prayer speaks of the resurrection of the dead. The first 3 are of primary obligation. The 4th is rabbinic, but incorporated into the fixed text. There are other additional components, such as hirhur, a series of supplications and requests added after the central blessings. Zayman is a pre-invitation when 3 or more people ate together, neverek shiakalnu. With 10, the divine name is explicitly mentioned because there is a community, that is, a minyan eating bread together. The conditions for the obligation to recite Birkat Hamazazin are having eaten 5-grain bread. A minimum amount, at least 1 kazait, equal to 27 grams today, rabbinically, sevia, satisfied, biblically. It is recommended to recite it in the same place where it was eaten at the same table, in fact, and preferably before the end of the digestion time, approximately 72 minutes, according to classical opinions. There are liturgical variations among Ashkenazim, Sephardim, and Yemenites in additional formulas and supplications, but the structure of 4 blessings remains. On Shabbat and holidays, special paragraphs are inserted, such as Retzeh on Shabbat, Yale v'yavo on holidays. If one ate bread and then forgot to recite it, one may do so while still satisfied, Shat Hasiva. And one who eats without bread does not recite Birkat Hamazon, but rather other later blessings, such as Mi'in Shalash and Al-Hamikya. The sages in Talmud Berachot 35a see in Birkat Hamazon not only gratitude, but also recognition of divine sovereignty over the earth and sustenance. It is an act of remembering God in satiety, not just in lack. In Jewish mysticism, Zohar, it is considered a time to channel abundance and sanctify matter. That's why it is recited with kavanah, focused intention. Birkat Hamazon is the paradigm of thanksgiving, the only explicitly biblical blessing, with roots in Moses and Joshua, enriched by history, David, Solomon, and the Sanhedrin of Yavna in the time of the Mishnah. It is a living text that combines gratitude for food, memory of the land and Jerusalem, and prayers for future redemption. Its recitation transforms a physical act, eating, into a spiritual and communal act. Now, we are obligated to study these basic Torah concepts, which are brought up for the first time in the Mishnah in this course, now that we have reached Mishnah Berakhot 3:4. In Hebrew, tahara means purity, and tuma is impurity. They are not equivalent to clean or unclean or sin. They are legal states that affect eligibility for certain sacred activities, especially those related to the sanctuary, sacrifices, and consecrated foods. Their biblical foundations are found in the books of Leviticus, chapters 11 and 15, and regulate the various types of impurity and their purification processes. The system establishes a map of the sacred, contact with death, certain bodily discharges, ritual leprosy, zeret, unclean animals, among other things that generate or attach impurity or tuma. Academic and rabbinic studies point to several purposes: separation and sacredness, preserving a special space for the sanctuary; spiritual pedagogy, awareness of the body and mortality; and community order, regulating coexistence in camps, pilgrimages, and rituals. The classification of impurity has several sources. Zeret, ritual leprosy, in Leviticus 13-14, which results in isolation, priestly examination, and even sacrifices in the temple for purification. Contact with a human corpse, as stated in Numbers 19, results in impurity lasting 7 days and is sprinkled with water from the red heifer. Sexual and menstruation fluids, as written in Leviticus 15, generate impurity lasting until nightfall after bathing. Some require sacrifice, but these are exceptional cases. And unclean animals and carrion, as explained in Leviticus 11, result in impurity lasting until nightfall after washing in the mikveh. The prophets Isaiah in chapter 1 and Amos in chapter 5 criticize the hypocrisy of performing purity rites without moral conduct. Rabbinic Judaism preserves this distinction. Tuma is not a sin and tahara is not a virtue. They are halakhic or normative conditions for certain sacred acts. And the recitation of the Shema is one of these acts. In fact, do you remember Mishnah Berakhot 1:1, the first of all, where Rabbi Eliezer says that the time for reading the night Shema is when the Kohanim priests entered to eat their teruma? Well, that first Mishnah is precisely what he's talking about, that to read the night Shema more than just a moment at sunset or the first 3 stars visible in the sky, the reading of the night Shema more than just an hour is a condition of purity. As we taught in that class, reciting the Shema is the most important commandment of the Torah, and the first one to be fulfilled each day at sunset, which is when the days begin in the Torah, as in Genesis. So, reading the night Shema more than just an hour is a condition of purity to connect with God in a direct, uninterrupted 911 call with your Father in heaven, the Creator of all. Leviticus 15 verses 16 to 18 states, "A man who has a nocturnal emission shall wash all his flesh in water and be unclean until evening. Both the man and the woman who had sexual relations remain unclean until evening and must wash." And Deuteronomy 23 verse 11, in the context of a military encampment, states, "If there is a man among you who is not clean because of a nocturnal emission, he shall go outside the camp and come in at evening." However, the nature of this impurity is one of the mildest impurities because it does not require sacrifice. One is cleansed with a ritual bath, mikveh, by simply waiting until evening. It involves temporary separation from sacred areas, but it is not a moral violation. So, as we've already seen, Ezra decreed that a baal keri should not study Torah or pray until immersing. This was to raise the consciousness of purity before spiritual life and, according to some, to moderate sexual activity. But this was even more counterproductive because it diminished Torah study and shalom bayit, or peace in the home. After the destruction of the temple, many laws of Tuma lost practical validity, except for menstruation, in Hebrew, niddah, and a few others, which remained in force because they affected marital relations. And as we said today, the baal keri is not legally required to attend a mikveh for prayer or study. However, hygiene and spiritual preparation are recommended. In Kabbalah, seminal emission represents a loss of vital potential. In Kabbalistic literature, it is considered a state of descent of spiritual energy, and the individual is invited to elevate oneself again through purification and concentration. However, legally, it is neither a sin nor a moral stain. From another Kabbalistic perspective, the problem with impurity or tuma is that unclean spirits, which are like shidim or rushid in torment, feed on tuma, and if a person is impure, they stick to him, and this creates spiritual blockages, bad ideas or bad feelings, and things like that, which we will not go into in depth for now, because the Mishnah will touch on them in due time. So, as we've already seen, Ezra decreed that a man with seminal emission should not study Torah or pray until he immersed himself. The intention was to elevate spiritual purity and perhaps moderate sexual behavior, but in practice it generated bittul Torah, a decline in study. Bittul actually means the nullification of the Torah, one of the gravest sins of the Torah itself. But here comes what the Mishnah actually wants to teach us. This case became paradigmatic. The rabbis learned that even well-intentioned decrees can become obstacles if their social impact is not measured. And so that we better understand all this power that the judges or rabbis of Israel have with the authority of the rabbinin, which, by the way, is an authority given to them by the Torah itself, let's look at other historical examples of decrees being revised or annulled, such as the prohibitions against working on Kol HaMoed, the intermediate days of the week-long festivals of Pesach and Sukkot, which are holidays that last a week, with the days in between being half a work day and half a day of rest. The judges then sought to preserve the festive character and decreed that people should not work, but this had the potential to generate serious economic losses for the community. The sages then established a system of hirhur permits for necessary work, preventing the rule from becoming unsustainable. Today, Kol Hamod, or the intermediate days of the week of Pesach and Sukkot, are half-work days and half-non-work days. Those who can avoid working them or work them half a day may do so, and those who must work may work them. There is also a famous decree against studying, Seferim Chitzanim, which means books external to tradition or Judaism, with the intention of protecting doctrinal purity. But this had an effect that limited access to wisdom texts that could strengthen faith. Thus, at different times, the reading of philosophy, science, and ethics was made more flexible, always under rabbinic guidance. Another example, perhaps the most famous, was maintaining the transmission of the oral Torah, the Mishnah, alive and oral to avoid rigidity and errors in texts, with copyists and even editions, and even worse, because it is the most common, with various and erroneous interpretations of the same text. This is the fundamental problem with reading texts, that texts do not defend themselves and are not interpretable and interpretive. When the oral Torah was not written down, the teacher or father explained everything because they could be asked questions. This prohibition of the Great Assembly against writing down the oral Torah, already during the Roman persecutions after the destruction of the temple in the 2nd century, almost obliterated the entire tradition, and there was a real threat that the entire oral Mishnah would be lost. But Rabbi Yehudah Hanassi redacted the Mishnah, formalizing the oral Torah for the first time. Later, the Talmud and Midrashim were compiled. All this was done by overriding a decree of the Great Assembly. Another example is the decree of lo tekodidu, not forming separate groups, intended to avoid divisions within the people. But it was sometimes applied too strictly, preventing legitimate local practices. Later poskim then carefully delineated when there were 2 courts of Halakha and when diversity was permitted. Other examples are the rabbinic regulations known as Gezerot Shmad, decrees under persecution. During times of Roman oppression, Tannaitic rabbis of the Mishnah ordered extreme restrictions. For example, not marrying women to avoid bringing children to suffering. Believe it or not, this happened during the Mishnah period with the destruction of the Second Temple by Titus in 70 AD, but when the danger passed, these regulations were reversed to restore community life. You should also understand the difference between rabbinic edicts, or those issued by the judges of the Sanhedrin, or the Great Assembly of Ezra and Nehemiah in biblical times. The Talmud establishes parameters for issuing takanah, amendments, and gezerot, foreclosures. Takanah are amendments requiring something to be done, meaning they are positive, and gezerot are negative barriers, meaning they prohibit something. Regarding this, the Talmud says, "No decree is made upon the public that which the majority cannot fulfill, Dava, 79b. There must be an impact assessment. If the decree causes bittul Torah, meaning less Torah or greater transgression, it is annulled. Temporary flexibility. Some rules are imposed as emergency measures and later withdrawn. And heskam, consensus in Hebrew, the need for acceptance by the entire community and the sages. In other words, these edicts are democratic, based on a vote by the Sanhedrin or Bet Din, with a minimum of 3 judges or rabbis. The important thing here is to decree rules that glorify and enhance the Torah. Encourage its study and practice. An ideal decree facilitates access to mitzvot, organizes life, and raises awareness without discouraging the community. A positive example is the blessings before Torah study because they were instituted by the sages and remain in force because they increase respect for learning without hindering it. Another positive example is the public reading of the Torah, instituted by Moses and reinforced by Ezra, which increases the dissemination of the sacred text. Note that reading the Torah in public or in the synagogue is not a commandment of God, but of his prophet Moses. Living Halakha recognizes the tension between ideals, purity, separation, and social reality, needs, human weaknesses. A pious but impractical decree can become counterproductive, weakening observance rather than strengthening it. The objective is the study that leads to action, Talmud Kiddushin 40b. Hedges and amendments must serve that end. The history of Judaism shows that rabbinic authority is aware of the limits of its normative power. The case of Ezra and the baal keri teaches that good intentions are not enough, for as a famous saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Therefore, it is essential to anticipate community acceptance and real impact. Successful takanah, or amendments, are those that reinforce study and practice, protect values without causing abandonment, and are revised when circumstances change, which is something that happens with the passing of each generation. Thus, the decrees that constitute the Gezerot not only enclose the Torah with regulations against doing something, but also amplify it and make it flourish with takanah, or amendments, that legislate regulations for doing something that glorifies the name of God and His Torah. Now, before concluding, we will conduct a comprehensive biographical study of Ezra from a scholarly/historical perspective and from the perspective of Jewish tradition and rabbinic literature. He lived in the mid-5th century BCE, during Persian rule over Judea, province of Yehud. His primary sources are the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah, plus references in 1 Esdras, Greek version, and Chronicles. Ezra is presented as a scribe skilled in the Torah of Moses, Ezra 7 verse 6, and as a religious leader charged with reorganizing the spiritual life of the community returning from the Babylonian exile. He is considered a Persian official authorized to promulgate religious laws in Judea. His arrival, approximately 458, coincided with legal and social reforms aimed at consolidating Jewish identity after the exile. Some historians see Ezra as a second Moses who reinstated the Torah as the constitution of the people. Among his documented contributions is the public reading of the Torah. Nehemiah 8, he is associated with the first great public assembly in Jerusalem, where the law was read and explained to the people. He also implemented marital reforms. Ezra promoted the dissolution of mixed marriages, Ezra 9-10, to preserve religious identity, which had suffered assimilation during the Babylonian exile. There was also a legal codification under his leadership, which institutionalized the Torah as a central norm. In fact, it is believed that the edition of the Torah of Moses that we have today was precisely Ezra's own work, with its Babylonian Hebrew letters and all its editorial configuration. Some believe that in Moses' time, each of the 5 books of the Pentateuch was an individual or separate scroll with Hebrew letters different from the Babylonian, but as with everything, there is always a diversity of opinions on this matter. For academia, Ezra is an agent of administrative Persianization who, however, reinforces Jewish identity by centering it on the Torah. His figure marks the transition from biblical Judaism, centered on the temple, to the Judaism of the book, a prelude to rabbinic Judaism, because Ezra was in fact a scribe, a doctor of the law, as he would later be known. The Talmud and Midrash call Ezra the scribe and compare him to Moses. If the Torah had not been given through Moses, it would have been given through Ezra, the Talmud says, Sanhedrin 21b. He is considered a prophet or quasi-prophet by some Midrashim, by others a sage of the highest rank. The sages attribute to him a series of takanah, positive decrees, to strengthen religious life. Public reading of the Torah on Mondays and Thursdays, Dava, 82a. Torah reading on Shabbat Mincha, Dava, 82a. Establishment of the system of local judges and organization of priestly genealogies. Decree of the baal keri, prohibiting Torah study and prayer without prior immersion, Berakhot 22a. This was precisely what today's lesson was about, and it was a decree that worked in its day. Make no mistake, it worked in its day. But with the passage of time, already in the late Second Temple period and after the destruction, it became a rather damaging decree. Other decrees attributed to Ezra were the ordination of Maimonides lay representatives for sacrifices and reforms regarding family purity and divorce. Ezra is seen as a restorer of the Jewish people after the exile, who returned the Torah to the center of national life. He is seen as a precursor to the Great Assembly, Knesset Hagdolah, the seed of rabbinic leadership. He is a model of humility and firmness. He combines legal authority with spiritual renewal. In some ways, as a scribe and interpreter, Ezra would be like the first Pharisee in history. That's it for today's lesson. See you in the next video.